I wouldn't lift a finger to try to get Jihadi Jack back to Canada. He's in prison now. That's where he should stay. That's where he should remain.
The political debate over what to do with Canadians who joined ISIS is back in the spotlight this week. That's after Britain stripped the man known as Jihadi Jack of his UK citizenship, leaving the terror suspect with only Canadian citizenship. Here's what Jack Letts told a British news outlet just yesterday.
I always expected Canada would help me, and they didn't, really. I hope Canada does take me from here if they can. They take me to Canada, that would be good.
In 2014, Jack Letts left his home in the UK and traveled to Syria. The British government says he went to join ISIS. In May of 2017, Letts was captured by Kurdish troops and held by them in northern Syria ever since. His father, John Letts, has long argued his son is innocent until proven guilty and deserves Canada's protection.
You can't just condemn someone without having some sort of evidence. But I think maybe it's better to have some of these people back here, monitored, seriously controlled, imprisoned, than running around the world doing horrible things. I mean, I have yet, it's not just I'm a father in denial. I've said from the beginning, show me the evidence. I will publicly condemn my son if he's done anything.
So what is the federal government prepared to do here? Will they bring Letts to Canada? Ralph Goodale is the Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness. He joins us now from Regina. Hi, Minister Goodale. Nice to see you.
Good to see you.
Thanks for making time for us. I know, Minister, that you've said the government is disappointed at what you characterized as the UK's offloading of responsibility where Mr. Letts is concerned. But was there any heads up from the UK that they would be revoking his citizenship?
Yes, they indicated a little bit in advance as this is what they intended to do. And when I received that indication, I indicated very clearly that Canada found that decision on the part of the UK to be very disappointing.
And what was their response?
Well, they acknowledged Canada's point of view. They didn't obviously change their minds, but the point is that we're dealing with very serious problems of terrorism and risks and threats around the world. And Western democracies need to work very closely together in concert with one another to combat that evil and to keep all of our people safe. And unilateral action like this, which effectively offloads an issue from one country to another, is not helpful. Did
you try and persuade them to reverse their decision prior to making it public?
Obviously, I made the argument on behalf of Canada very, very strongly. They had clearly made up their minds, but they understood in no uncertain terms that Canada was not pleased with the decision that they had made.
Were any other ministers, for example, like Minister Freeland, involved in the effort to try and persuade them to change their position?
Well, there were several ministers that were making the case.
Was Minister Freeland among them?
Yes, she was.
All right. I wanted to follow up then on what's actually happened with Mr. Letts and ask if there has been any contact between consular officials and Jack Letts since February of 2018, the last time that kind of contact was publicly reported.
Not to my knowledge. The point is that he is currently in custody in a Kurdish facility, and Canada is not obliged legally to facilitate his travel, and we won't.
But there had been previously contact from consular officials in which Mr. Letts sort of pleaded his case and said that he would, rather be in a Canadian prison, for example. I'm wondering if there has been, so you're saying there has been no contact since then, since essentially the case became public?
Not to my knowledge. That's a matter for the Department of Global Affairs, but to my knowledge, no.
Has the Canadian government made the decision not to repatriate Mr. Letts?
As I said, we have no obligation to facilitate his travel from his present circumstances, and we have no intention of facilitating that travel.
Couldn't you bring him back and prosecute him, for example? He has admitted in an ITV interview to joining ISIS.
Well, what may or may not have been said in an interview and translating that into effective evidence that will stand up in a court of law are two quite different things. And the allied countries are trying our very best to cooperate on the collection and the preservation of evidence, but it's still an enormous challenge to collect the evidence that will have the integrity to be convincing and effective in a North American justice system.
But whatever evidence has surmised or been put forth already has already been effective enough to convince your government not to do anything to repatriate him, correct?
Well, as I've said, we are under no legal obligation to facilitate his travel, and we will not do that.
But I just want to know why you're making that determination. He has not been convicted, for example, of a crime, right? He is a Canadian citizen. Your government has said a Canadian is a Canadian, right? That means something, does it not?
Our first obligation is to look after the national security of the country and the safety of Canadians. This individual and others have made the calculated decision to leave the comfortable confines of Canadian democracy, to travel halfway around the world, to associate themselves with the most evil and violent terrorism in several generations. They need to assume the consequences for their responsibility. We will ensure that the law and the Constitution are applied, but we will not facilitate their travel.
Are you certain of what circumstances they face there? I understand that they are detained by the Kurds. I also understand, though, that the Kurds have said we don't want to keep them here forever. And in fact, they could face, for example, being handed over to the regime in Syria, which we know is a very violent one. They could be turned over to Iraq, where they could face the death penalty. In those instances, what kind of responsibility does the Canadian bear for a Canadian citizen?
Well, as I said, we will ensure that the law and the Constitution are applied in the provision of consular services in the most dangerous and dysfunctional part of the world. It is very difficult to deliver those services on any kind of regular or reliable basis. We will take all the steps that are necessary to ensure that Canadians are protected and that national security is properly protected. Some individuals have chosen to put themselves in harm's way, which limits the ability of any government to respond to their circumstances.
Okay, so for example, we're talking about Mr. Letts, but he is among, a number of Canadians who are over there. There are 6 men, the latest number shows 6 men, 9 women, and 18 children. Is the application of what you're saying the same for those kids?
We have examined very carefully the circumstances of the children who are there at the behest or because of the circumstances of their parents. We're looking very carefully at circumstances that may affect orphans. What we don't want to do is to create a set of circumstances that in fact causes a second generation of terrorist behavior.
So can you explain what you mean by that? I understand that you're looking at it differently. Does that mean that there is the possibility, for example, of repatriation for those kids?
In the case of children in extremely vulnerable circumstances, there are issues around identification, for example, that would need to be very carefully resolved, as well as other factors bearing upon the location of the children and the ultimate location of the children. We will examine those cases carefully, but number one priority always is the safety and security of Canadians.
Does that mean, though, that if a child is a Canadian citizen or born to a Canadian citizen in a camp right now, in a Kurdish camp in Syria, is that a circumstance that you're talking about where the child is in danger that the Canadian government would be looking to be of aid? I'm just trying to make this understandable for our viewers, right? Because I take your point, and I know you have to be careful in how you say it, but it's really unclear.
It's a field that requires a great deal of very careful thought and attention. The circumstances of children is significantly different than the circumstances of adults. You have to examine very carefully how the child got into those circumstances. You have to examine who at the present time has the legal authority and responsibility over those children. And you also have to determine what are the appropriate steps to take in order to protect those children for the future. It is a very, very complex question that involves not only domestic law, but international law, and we are paying very, very careful attention.
Does that mean there are, for example, any employees of the government, any members of the armed forces who are on the ground over there trying to ascertain the details of which you're talking about?
At the present time, not to my knowledge, we are acquiring information and making inquiries through other means, but not in the particular camps that are being referred to.
Before I let you go, Mr. Letts, of course, has, as I mentioned, expressed a desire to come back. I know it's a political issue here. What do you think is going to happen to Mr. Letts if he isn't repatriated here?
Well, one of the things that we will examine for the future with our allies is how we can keep the circumstances of these camps safe and secure, and what level of international cooperation is appropriate and possible in the circumstances to make sure that they themselves do not become hotbeds for violence or some future terrorist explosion.
Is that possible, though, given that the Kurds don't want to be holding those people right now?
It's very, very difficult. Nothing about terrorism is easy. So we are working carefully with our Five Eyes allies and our G7 allies to try to have the maximum amount of international cooperation and collaboration to keep all of our countries safe and secure. This is a dangerous, dysfunctional part of the world. Within that region, there are hotbeds like the camps that carry particular dangers associated with them. We have agreed with our allies that we're going to try to work closely together to collect evidence, preserve evidence that can be usable in our respective courts of law. And there may be other fields of activity where we can collaborate with each other to try to defuse these dangerous situations to the maximum extent possible.
What's the line, though, with Mr. Letts? As I mentioned, the Kurds don't want to keep them in those camps. If he is, for example, sent to Iraq and faces the death penalty, is that the line in which the government then gets involved on this side? Or is it if he's released to the Assad regime? What is it? Is there a line for this government?
This is a set of circumstances that is evolving. We are obviously pursuing every dimension of this with a great deal of care and attention and prudence. Our bottom line in every case is the safety and security of Canadians. And we will look after that line to the maximum extent humanly possible.
All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Minister Goodale. I appreciate your time today. That's Public Safety Minister Ralph Goodale.
Thank you.
Should Canada repatriate Jack Letts, the young man known as Jihadi Jack, who left his home in Britain to join ISIS? That question has resurfaced after the UK revoked his British citizenship. That leaves Letts detained in a prison in Syria with just his Canadian citizenship. Moments ago, Public Safety Minister Ralph Goodale told us the government is not legally obligated to bring Letts to Canada and has no intention of doing so. Leah West was listening in. She's a former Department of Justice National Security lawyer, now a lecturer at Carleton University's Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. Hi, nice to see you again.
Nice to see you as well.
Thanks for coming in. Let me ask you about that central thesis that Minister Goodale put forward, and that is that the government has no legal obligation to bring Jack Letts to Canada.
That's not wrong. There's nothing in Canadian law that would require Canada to go overseas and bring Jack Letts back, nor any of the other adults who are currently in Kurdish custody. But that could change if the situation on the ground changes. And also, there is an obligation under international law to do what's best in the best interests of children, all children. It's the Convention on the Rights of the Child. That's an international treaty to which Canada has been a party to since 1991, and it requires governments to take action considering what's best for children and to protect and safeguard the lives of children.
And I do want to delve in a little bit closer to what the minister said, where kids in the Kurdish prison or in the Kurdish system who are being detained are involved. But I just want to circle back to that point of around Jack Letts specifically, because that's what's generated a lot of the scrutiny right now. If right now, the situation is he's being held by the Kurds. If that were to change, as has happened for other prisoners in which, for example, they're released to Iraq, face the death penalty, are sentenced to death, or like the Kurds have said, they don't want to keep these prisoners, are handed off to the Syrian regime. Does the obligation legally change at all for the government?
Under law, there's not a piece of legislation I could point to that would say this is the obligation that's on the government in those cases. However, we've seen Canadians settle with the government where they have faced mistreatment at the hands of the Syrian government, where Canada did not successfully kind of intervene on their behalf and ensure that they were safeguarded. This government has done a lot, especially with the passage of C-59, to ensure that actions of Canadians and Canadian officials don't lead to mistreatment. And I would say inaction in this case could very likely lead to mistreatment of Canadians should that happen.
Does it matter? I mean, one of the lines that the minister kept talking about, and I take the point, I think there's a lot of Canadians that feel the same way, is that, you know, people like him went over there to fight with a terrorist organization or to support a terrorist organization. That was a decision that they made. He hasn't been convicted, though.
Correct.
Does that matter at all?
I think it matters from a moral standpoint. It doesn't necessarily matter from a legal standpoint. But from a rule of law country, which we tout ourselves so frequently as, these Canadians are being held indefinitely in a prison without having been convicted of any offense. Canada should repatriate those Canadians so they can be held account according to our laws, and to have the evidence of what they've done be put on trial and to hold them accountable.
You know that the argument is going to be twofold in response to that. The first is the same one that I just said, that people are going to say, why should we expend resources, put Canadians in danger in order to bring them back? The second is, does the evidence that we have on these individuals meet the evidentiary bar here in Canada, so that instead of just bringing them back and letting them roam in society, we actually can have a reasonable chance of convicting them and making sure that they're not roaming free in society?
Right. So on the should we do it, I think, and this is, going to be a personal opinion, but I think our commitments to the international community, to global terrorism, like the Minister of Public Safety said that terrorism is a global problem and we all need to work together to stop it. Yes, we do. And Canada should fulfill its responsibilities to hold people accountable. These people left Canada. They were radicalized here, traveled abroad. They've committed atrocities against others. We should be holding them accountable, and we should be wanting to show that. Our criminal justice system is not just about punishment. It's also about deterrence and rehabilitation. We need to put our money where our mouth is on that.
In this case, though, Mr. Letts didn't travel from Canada.
Does
that make things different, too?
Yeah, it could make things different in terms of the offenses he can be charged with. Okay. In Mr. Letts' case, he can't be charged with probably some of the easier crimes to prove, traveling from Canada to commit a terrorist offense or facilitate terrorism. Those are off the table for him. So it would be harder. We would have to convict him for stuff he actually did abroad, or potentially things he's said.
We know he has said stuff in an interview. He said he did join ISIS.
Right. And in terms of admissible evidence, statements of the accused are admissible evidence. They could be used against him in a court of law. They're on camera or in print. That is evidence of his guilt. So I think we don't have a good sense of the evidence that we have against any of these individuals. And like you pointed out to the minister, he's satisfied that this individual is a terrorist. There must be evidence there to support that.
Before I let you go, I do want to delve in a bit about what the minister said on children. It is, I mean, we've talked to him about this issue before, and I noticed a bit of a deviation from past answers. I want to read exactly what he said. He said, they're looking carefully at the circumstances that affect orphans, and quote, what we don't want to do is to create a set of circumstances that in fact causes a second generation of terrorists behavior. He wouldn't go so far as to say, they're going over there and trying to get the kids back. And there, I should remind our viewers, I said in the interview, but there's 18 kids. That's the latest count right now.
Most of them under the age of 5.
Right. That's more than there are women or men who have gone over to fight with ISIS. What is the consideration for how do you interpret that?
So I can see the distinction between orphans. Part of that is from the Kurds themselves, who have said, we don't want to separate families. And that makes sense. If you're the Kurds, you want these individuals out of your custody. If you remove the children, it relieves some of the incentive of taking out the adults from their care as well. And we saw recently that orphans have been repatriated by other countries such as Germany. It does kind of create a greater incentive of these individuals are truly helpless in these camps. But I think the other issue is you have to repatriate Canadians to prevent the second generation of ISIS members. He talked about what we can do to ensure that the camps remain safe and that this doesn't happen again. Take back your citizens and prosecute them.
Do you think that in this case of the kids, and I'm wondering because we can't talk about this, it's a political, eventually
Absolutely.
There are political considerations, right? And there's an election coming up. We heard what Mr. Scheer, for example, was saying, I wouldn't lift a finger to help him come back. Is there do you think the political calculation might be, and maybe in the absence of an election, let's say a few months after, different when it comes to repatriating those kids versus others?
Goodness, I hope so. I really think that we have an obligation to safeguard these children. These children are innocent. They had no choice in the circumstances that they now face. And I think we are definitely creating a circumstance where we are potentially creating a second generation of ISIS the longer we leave them there.
All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Ms.
Thank
West.
you.
Appreciate your time. That's Leah West of Carleton University's Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. Appreciate your time.
We're dealing with very serious problems of terrorism and risks and threats around the world. And Western democracies need to work very closely together in concert with one another to combat that evil and to keep all of our people safe. And unilateral action like this, which effectively offloads an issue from one country to another, is not helpful.
That was the Public Safety Minister spelling out Canada's displeasure with the UK's decision to revoke citizenship from Jack Letts, also known as Jihadi Jack. Letts' Canadian-born father is pleading with Ottawa to intervene on his son's behalf, but the government says Canada is under no obligation to bring the formerly dual citizen to Canadian soil. Let's bring the power panel back in. Stockwell, Tiffany, and Françoise. Françoise, I'll start with you. We'll definitely get into the sort of political considerations about even touching the subject, but the UK-Canada dynamic is also interesting on this. A government source tells me that Minister Freeland met with, we know she did that conference in early July. That means that they have known since at least early July that this was going to happen. Clearly they tried to voice their displeasure, but it didn't change anything.
They actually tried very hard to let it be solely UK problem. And the UK kind of beat them to the punch by saying, no, we're removing his citizenship. That might not be too Canadian way to do so. I know that a lot of people who are listening to us or reading about that story wish that our government would do exactly the same, because there's something fundamentally not okay to hear that some of our citizens, whatever type of citizens, go abroad to participate in terrorist act. I mean, today I was in shock to see a reservist from the army have links with neo-Nazi, and that's within. So we are in worrisome time. I totally agree with Ralph Goodale that this is not an obligation that we have at this time. If some people want to analyze this on the Kadar front and so on, it's different legally, because at this point in time, Mr. Lett has not been found guilty of anything, is not being tortured as
well, we don't
know, but I'm sure he would voice it, or his parents would. It's for in the future, so we have to let where he's at in a Kurdish place there and see what will unfold. Like you said, if the situation change and you would get the death penalty, we've got some decisions from the Supreme Court of Canada stating what the government has to do with a citizen, and unless his citizenship is removed, which I don't know if we've ever done that to except maybe Conrad Black or somebody. No, I'm just kidding. But anyway, it's at this point in time, I think it's too early. Sad for Canada that UK decided you're no longer a citizen of ours, but he doesn't have that many links with us either.
Yeah, well, it's his dad. Yeah, it's interesting, Tiffany, because you can sort of, the argument that Leah West puts forward is a convincing one. The idea that if you say you're a country that wants to, engage in the global war on terrorism, you should be doing what you can to bring these people back and fully prosecute them, not just release them into society, but prosecute them. But the political calculation is also very obvious. You can see why, the Conservatives and the Liberals would not touch this with a 10-foot stone 2 months out from an election.
Well, absolutely. This is a unfortunate time for this to be taking place, for sure. I'd say there's a protocol piece here to whether or not there should be some level of a protocol if a state decides to abdicate its responsibility and revoke citizenship, and that impacts another state like us in this case. But there are so many different dynamics at place here, and as we always talk about when we get into election timing, it's not rational, isn't prevalent. It's whatever this fastest and snippiest message is, and so opposition opposition parties are definitely out drawing a line in the sand about what they would do. But of course, a sitting prime minister and ministers have to weigh in many different pieces and can't comment on specifics of cases in the same ways. And so as this plays out in the media in an election dialogue, it's quite different than it would be at any other time.
And Stockwell, I should say that you heard Minister Goodale unequivocally say it's not going to happen. Andrew Scheer, we played a clip earlier in the show saying the same thing. The NDP, I just want to read part of their statement. They were asked by my colleague Julie Van Dusen, do you think we should repatriate Jihadi Jack? As much as we loathe the actions of Canadians who have committed terrorist offences, putting them in Canadian prisons and having them go through the Canadian justice system is at the core of a society that's rule-based and respects the rule of law. So the NDP, a bit of an outlier when it comes to the position on whether or not to repatriate him.
The NDP is an outlier. They're also outside of the United Nations Declaration. Article 8 of the United Nations is very clear that any state can, in fact, revoke the citizenship of one of its so-called citizens based on certain criteria, all of which Canada meets. And the UN Article 8 goes on to say that even if that person winds up becoming stateless, there is no responsibility or no obligation to be felt by the country that is trying to protect itself. I don't have the same level of confidence in what I just heard from Ralph Goodale. He actually was negative towards the Brits for protecting themselves by revoking this guy's citizenship. This man has joined a terrorist group that delights, and I say delights and rewards people for blowing up little children, for massacring women. He knowingly and willingly joined that group. He has, in my view,
he hasn't been convicted.
lost. You know what?
I know what you're saying. I'm not trying to defend him, but I'm just saying.
Judge Phelan in Canada just ruled not that long ago that Helmut Oberlander his citizenship must be revoked because he was a member of a group, a Nazi group, committing atrocities. And the judge went on to say there is actually no evidence that Oberlander himself did any of the atrocities, but he aligned himself with that group, and in the mind of the judge and the courts, that's enough. He had his citizenship revoked. And Prime Minister Trudeau, remember it wasn't that long ago, he was saying a citizen is a citizen is a citizen, nobody should be revoked. But under Stephen Harper's government from 2007 to 2014, 65 people had their citizenships revoked. Since Mr. Trudeau's been in office, 235 people have had their citizenships revoked. This man, so-called Jihadi Jack, has done a terrible thing. There should be a clear signal sent to any young person or old person in Canada, and the road to Jihadi Jack the message to him should be, hit the road, Jack. You ain't coming home no more.
I think under the law, though, that was eventually revoked by the Liberals, and you probably know this better than me, the person had to be convicted in order to have their citizenship revoked. Exactly. There might have been a part of the law that allowed for something different, but my understanding was you had to be convicted in order for your citizenship to be revoked.
And that's the problem right now with Jack Lett. And the other big legal problem that Canada has is that even if we bring him back, we can't pursue him under the criminal code because he didn't leave Canada to go commit his so-called crime.
It's a lot harder to prove than a lot of the others.
I don't know which section of the criminal code they could use on that front. So to say bring him back and try him here and let Canadian justice take care of it, and even says, oh, I'm willing to get the full thing of Canadian justice, but he knows full well, I'm sure some lawyers told him, you won't be found guilty of anything at this point in time because there's no, and I don't think that any government could pass a law that would make something illegal retroactively because it's not supposed to be so in criminal law.
He did say in a TV interview, though, that he joined ISIS. Like, is that, Leo West was saying that statement of the accused, would that not factor into being able to prosecute him?
Yes, but on what charge exactly? To be part of a terrorist
facilitating
group?
terrorism? Is that something?
I don't know. I mean, it would be.
It'd be harder than proving that he left Canada to join ISIS.
I think we should venture more on the fact that of what Stockwell was saying. Let's review the fact. Maybe Britain is on the right track in saying we don't need to give citizenship. It's something. It's not a right. It's something that you have to earn in a lot of subjective aspect. It's not a given.
I just have a few seconds left. Is it a vulnerability for the Prime Minister, Tiffany, given the statements prior? A Canadian is a Canadian. Does this message today, can it be rectified with the message that they delivered previously?
I would say that the real difficulty here is that there is no simple message. It's a very complicated matter, and it's one that those that are sitting in government spaces have to be very careful about in terms of how it impacts future cases. And so it's going to be a complex one as it moves forward.
Well, I appreciate everyone's insights today. Thank you so much. Thanks to the Power Panel this evening, Stockwell Day, Tiffany Gooch, and Françoise Boivin. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video. Thanks for watching.